Hey there, ready to dive into some fascinating research that challenges how we think about how democracies emerge.
Always up for a good challenge, especially when it comes to something so fundamental.
We're taking a deep dive into income and democracy, a compelling academic paper by Asimoglu, Johnson, Robinson, and Yared.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
Get ready for some surprising findings because this one really shakes things up.
I'm intrigued already. Lay it on me.
All right, let's start with the question. Do you think countries just automatically become more democratic as they get richer?
Well, that's kind of what we've always been led to believe, right? It's like the classic modernization theory, economic growth, it paves the way for democracy.
Exactly. The idea is that a thriving economy kind of cultivates this culture of democracy.
Right.
People are more educated, they have more free time,
Yeah.
and they start demanding a voice in how they're governed. Plus, with increased wealth, countries can invest in democratic institutions like courts, parliaments, a free press.
It sounds pretty logical. It's almost like a recipe. Add economic growth, sprinkle in some education, and voila, democracy.
Right.
But this study, it kind of throws a wrench in that simple formula.
Big time. These researchers weren't messing around. They used super robust data like the Freedom House Political Rights Index and the Polity 4 dataset to measure democracy across the globe.
Yeah, those are pretty standard.
We're talking data going back to the 19th century, even as far back as 1500.
Wow, that's comprehensive. They really wanted to get the full picture.
And they didn't stop there. They brought in economic data from sources like the Penn World Tables and Madison's historical data. This wasn't a quick glance. This was a deep, multi-century examination of political and economic change.
That makes their findings even more striking then. So what did they find? Did they use like some pretty sophisticated statistical tools to figure out if income actually causes democracy?
Here's where things get really interesting. Instead of just looking at correlations, they used fixed effects and instrumental variables.
Okay, I'm not a statistician, so break that down for me.
Okay, think of it this way. Imagine you're testing if a new energy drink improves athletic performance.
Okay.
You couldn't just compare people who drink it to those who don't. What if the drinkers were already more athletic to begin with?
Right, they might just be naturally better.
Precisely. These statistical techniques are kind of like leveling the playing field. They help isolate the specific impact of income on democracy, taking all those other factors into account.
Oh, like separating the effect of the energy drink from someone's natural athletic ability.
Exactly. And their findings.
Mm.
No clear evidence that income directly causes democracy, at least not in the short term. We're talking 5 or 10 years.
Huh. So even when you look over longer periods, like 50 or 100 years,
Even then, that causal link was shaky at best.
that's a major challenge to what we've always thought. Then it's like finding out that that energy drink doesn't actually make you a better athlete.
So we're left with a bit of a puzzle. If income doesn't cause democracy, why is there this strong correlation? Especially when you look at wealthy democratic nations, like those in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Right, that's the million-dollar question. And I bet this study offers some explanations for that.
They do. They have a couple really intriguing explanations.
Well, let's hear them.
Okay, so what are these intriguing explanations? Spill the tea.
Well, one possibility is that we're just not being patient enough. Maybe it takes much longer than we think for economic changes to really kind of ripple through society and then reshape its political systems.
Ah, so we're thinking way beyond 100 years.
Way beyond 100 years, maybe even multiple generations.
Yeah, like planting a tree.
Exactly.
You don't see its full impact for decades.
Right. You gotta be patient.
But there's another more compelling explanation that the study puts forward. It suggests that history matters a lot.
That's right. It's the divergent paths hypothesis. Choices made centuries ago during crucial turning points in a nation's development. It can have a really lasting impact on both its economic and political future.
It's like those choose-your-own-adventure books we read as kids.
Exactly.
Early decisions set the course of the entire story.
Take European colonialism, for example. It unfolded very differently across the world, leading to drastically different outcomes.
Yeah, North America ended up on a vastly different path compared to Latin America or Africa.
Huge differences.
So some countries were set on a path toward democracy and economic growth, while others were led down a different road.
A road often marked by authoritarianism and limited opportunities.
And did the researchers find evidence to support this divergent paths idea?
They found some fascinating evidence, especially when they examined former European colonies.
Okay, so tell me more about this. What kind of evidence?
Well, they looked at things like the mortality rates of European settlers in those colonies.
The mortality rates.
Yeah, that this might sound a little strange, But those early death rates actually reveal a lot about the types of institutions Europeans established.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. If settlers were dying in droves, they weren't exactly planning to settle down and build a sustainable society.
Ah, so they were more likely to create extractive institutions,
Hmm.
focused on exploiting resources and just getting out as quickly as possible.
Exactly. They weren't investing in long-term development or fair governance structures. And sadly, the effects of those early choices can still be felt centuries later.
It's almost as if those initial conditions, they determined the trajectory of these countries' political evolution.
In a way, they did. They had long-lasting effects. And it's not just settler mortality. They also found that the density of the indigenous population in 1500 play a role.
How so?
Areas with denser populations were more susceptible to exploitation and control through authoritarian means.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a lot easier to impose harsh rule when you're dealing with a large, concentrated population.
Right. And another crucial factor they looked at was the level of constraints on executive power. At the time, colonies gained independence.
So how much power did the leaders have right from the start?
And it turns out those early constraints, or the lack thereof, really significantly impacted a country's democratic development.
That's pretty intuitive. If a country begins with a system where power is concentrated at the top,
Hmm.
transitioning to a more democratic system later on is so much harder.
It's like trying to steer a large ship that's already heading in a certain direction.
You need a lot of effort to change course.
Yeah. So taking all of this into account,
Yeah.
how do you think the correlation between income and democracy looks over that long haul?
Okay, so we're looking at the really big picture now.
That's where it gets really mind-blowing. They looked at data spanning 500 years.
Wow.
And over that period, the correlation is incredibly strong. But remember, this time span covers all those critical turning points we've been talking about. The emergence of different forms of government, the age of exploration colonialism. These events shaped both the political and economic landscapes of nations.
So it's like observing this massive tapestry.
Yes.
You see these intricate patterns and connections, but it's impossible to isolate one thread and say it caused the entire design.
Exactly. It's not that income caused democracy over those 500 years. It's that both income and democracy were shaped by these major historical shifts.
So we're getting a much more nuanced picture than we initially imagined.
We are indeed.
It's definitely making me rethink things.
That's what good research does.
Yeah.
And this study has one more surprise up its sleeve. It has to do with economic crises. You might think, when things get tough, that it would lead to instability and even weaken democracies,
That's what I would thought. Tough times, less freedom.
right? But this research suggests the opposite economic crises. They actually seem to increase the chances of transitioning to democracy.
Wait, really? How does that work?
Well, it seems that economic turmoil, it destabilizes dictatorships more than democracies. So when things go south, those in power, they kind of lose their grip, and it creates an opening for change.
Ah, it's like pressure building up in a system. Eventually, something has to give.
Exactly. And in this case, it's often the old authoritarian regime that crumbles. It's almost like a reminder that even in the midst of hardship, there can be these seeds of progress.
But why are dictatorships more vulnerable during these crises?
Well, dictatorships often rely on patronage, controlling resources to maintain power. When the economy tanks, they have less to offer their supporters and their grip weakens. Think of it like a house of cards. Once the foundation shakes, the whole thing collapses.
Got it. But democracies are built differently.
Exactly. While democracies aren't immune to crises, they tend to have these mechanisms for handling discontent and channeling those frustrations constructively.
Yeah, it's almost as if they have these built-in shock absorbers,
Yeah.
helping them weather those storms.
So if we step back and consider everything we've discussed, it's clear that the relationship between income and democracy, it's far more complex than we might have thought. Income alone isn't a guarantee, and history plays a much bigger role than we might have realized.
You can't just look at a country's GDP and predict their political future. It's about understanding their past, their unique circumstances.
And while there are no easy answers or quick fixes, there's a whole world of fascinating patterns and possibilities to uncover. Who knew economic crises could be potential catalysts for positive change?
This whole deep dive has really made me rethink things. So what are some of the big takeaways for our listeners?
Well, first, achieving democracy. It's not about simplistic solutions. It's about addressing those deep-rooted historical legacies and cultivating institutions that nurture both economic and political freedom.
We need to understand that progress, it takes time. Solutions must be tailored to each country's unique needs and history.
Absolutely. Second, we must recognize the enduring impact of history. Choices made centuries ago continue to shape the world today. We're not just passive observers, we have a role to play in building a better future.
It's like inheriting a garden. We didn't plant the original seeds, but we're responsible for tending it, making choices that will impact its growth for years to come.
That's a great analogy. And finally, I think it's about being curious, staying engaged. We can challenge assumptions, dig deeper, and contribute to building a more just and democratic world.
This deep dive has definitely left me with a lot to think about. What other historical events or cultural factors might influence this complex interplay between income and democracy? It's a question worth pondering, and maybe even sparks a deep dive of your own.
I couldn't agree more. Remember, even without all the answers, the journey of discovery is a reward in itself. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop striving for a better world.